shouldn't even be here. Mum's the word, I burn down the house, I gum up the works. I'm the wrong vibration, I summon the earth. When the cuffs break, better make enough of the cure. I go proto-human, I'm so unruly. Architect of my Kodo Kushi on guard. Hop in the box of chopped arms on the blocks beyond the pop art stockyard. Got a red phone right to the inside. I can turn a rib cage into wind chimes. You don't want to engage, kiddo, it's a burden to bear. It's a whirly bird, never seen the surface to air. I lost count of the cooks, every coward and crook. Any memory of semblance of it out of the woods. I'm too unrubbed elbows, well in the weeds. Even a good eye couldn't find the edge of my seat. Oh, potpourri of confusing powers all mashed together and shooting outward. Intel gleam from the Prince of Dark. Scarecrow every 10 per infinity yards. When a spirit investor consider living apart. It's official, I ain't signing for the mission alert. My call of duty, stay all consuming. Even if y'all see him as a dollar movie. Look, best in show, I'm the worst there is. That pest control is no urban myth. That floating skull just won't shut up. It's on a business trip, I'm below the crust. Y'all know what's up. Bad news from the black lung. Used to flatline, that shit is so last month. Yo, I don't need money to burn. I need sunsets purple and mother of pearl. Come on. I'ma need you to ease back. No peace out, lead to the evac. Don't be where you be at. I've been looking for a reason to react. I'ma need you to reset. No plea, no please, no defense. Don't creep in the deep end. I've been looking for a reason to see red. Territorial organisms, each glorifying our poor decisions. I'm a force you can forecast, swarming insects who eat all the corn like war is business. I'm pageant waiting for my shallow grave. Patch me in from that astral plane. Ain't ringing the bell, I pass through the walls of cool burgundy in both tooth and claw. Midnight manage an incredible feat. A GPS collar on the neck of the beast to go. Beep, beep, any neck of the reef. Put a reaper on a second week of medical leave. I'm a seer, I can tell you how the curtain descend. And maybe hint at how it isn't with a circle of friends. I go by with the black sheep. Rah, catch me a patsy. Spaz, unravel and blaspheme. Riddler to keep the gate. It's a Groundhog D-Day, GCH. I was born on a horse at a steeplechase. My forte's frontline real estate. Plus steak and breeds, I take bloody as hell. If it burn black, point him at the honey and milk. I ain't sitting while you sully the well. I turn up in a jiff. Jackknife when I jump in the pit. 100 hands, 1 million eyes, 2 bleeding gums. I will survive. That last line's rose-colored only for a limited time. It all shifts when you militarize. I had a vision of a feather on a seasonal wing. In the shadow of a gargoyle flinging a brick. Lean in, steal your chips. Where I'm from, y'all wouldn't even be in a mix. Hey. I'ma need you to ease back. No peace out, lead to the evac. Don't be where you be at. I've been looking for a reason to react. I'ma need you to reset. No plea, no please, no defense. Don't creep in the deep end. I've been looking for a reason to see red.
All right. Let me go off of here. My internet just completely crashed, so I don't know what happened in those couple of minutes there. So apologies if it dropped out or if the song just looped. I have no idea. But off to a great start. Welcome back to Notify Live, guys. It's a new year. And I have on one of my favorite LinkedIn commenters of all time, Paul Ivsin. Thanks for coming on, Paul.
Thanks, Brad. Lovely to be here.
Yeah, thanks, man. Hopefully you weren't hanging out there too long on my internet. Hopefully it stays up. Hopefully it stays up too. So Man, I'm gonna start you out just like I do with every guest. Tell me a little about your background, kind of how you got into clinical research, and a little bit about what you're doing today.
Yeah, well, I feel like all of your guests have different variants of the same story of how they kind of backed into the job. So I won't disappoint. Very very similar. I started out as far away as possible. I was studying philosophy at the University of Chicago. I was about as academic Ivy Tower as you could get at the time. At some point, realized that was not going to be the way I wanted to live my life, and like every good college dropout, I got into software development, mixed in with the wrong folks, and really interesting, intellectually enriching area. Jumped around to a lot of different industries, and finally decided I liked the business behind the software more than I liked the software, and then fell in with a group that was doing clinical trial patient recruitment, and not to date myself too much, but they were running newspaper ads and radio ads, and it was going to an 800 number, and they would fax those leads to sites, and that was it. They didn't really know how it was going. They couldn't really demonstrate that there was a good ROI. They knew the phones were ringing, and we had to design a program where the sites could then fax back a form and kind of check off, and it was kind of the earliest lead tracker we could do pre-internet. But I just thought it was the most fascinating thing, and eventually joined that company and stayed in clinical trial patient recruitment specifically, in different aspects of it, whether on the data side or agency side, for the last 20 plus years. Finally ended up at my current gig, Continuum. Met up with Neil Weissman, who runs that group, and just hit it off. And they were bringing in a lot of data in house. They were relying on vendors, and they needed someone to help them kind of think that through. And that just got me really excited. As you've seen, I tend to get overreact positively to a lot of data that's available. So this was a great fit, and just past the 5-year mark with them, really focused on trying to figure out how to solve enrollment challenges, especially with some of the trickier studies we've got out there.
So you guys do like essentially like the central recruitment?
We very much, yep, that is our bread and butter. We like to say people don't call us for the easy studies. We really only get the hard ones. We're not out there recruiting for your flu study or even your weight loss study for the most part. It's a lot of immunology, a lot of neurology. Lately, we've started to get. There's been a lot of increased interest in oncology. There's always been this belief, and I amongst others have had that belief that you really can't recruit patients for oncology trials. But there's also a surge of patients who are trying to, take more medical decision making into their own hands and not be guided by, the box that their local oncologist wants to put them in. So there's a lot of information seeking out there, and how do you connect those people to study opportunities? I think is a big growth area.
Yeah, I mean, I think challenging. Do you think central recruitment companies, or whatever you want to call them, vendors, do you think they get a bad rap? I mean, I know talk among sites is, sites are oftentimes resistant to central campaigns. And some of this I feel like dates back to the old, like, I can't remember the early, some of the earlier companies were just sending you garbage leads, and some of it still happens to this day. But do you think that still persists, like, especially amongst the site community?
I think it still persists, and I honestly, a lot of it might be still well deserved. I think it's a pretty mixed bag. If I think back to when I started, there were really kind of two strands in patient recruitment. A lot of the early companies, including mine, but if I think about going back to the 90s, you had Joan Bachheimer and Bonnie Brescia forming BBK. MMG, people forget MMG stood for Matthews Media Group. That was Molly Matthews. Diana Anderson and company was out there. They turned into DAC, turned into Imperial DAC, turned into Imperial CRS. But if you and then Liz Munch running Medici. So there are all these women kind of breaking out of pharma and creating agencies, and they were really very empathy driven, very insight based, focused on this idea of, there's got to be a better way to connect with patients. And in the midst of all that, you had a Curian come in, and a Curian was kind of the classic boiler room, operation. Lots of complaints with the Better Business Bureau, but a lot of sponsors who really like their model, right? And
Curian's the one I recall, like my early experiences with central recruitment and being like, oh, this is not good. I think definitely
it was crazy how much sponsors seem to really glom on to the model, and how much everyone else, patients and sites, really disliked it. And there's a little bit of that still today. You see that in a lot of the
comment from
kind of
still occurring. So yeah, I don't disagree.
Yeah.
And I mean, is that problematic? Like, do you guys, again, like, do you see, and I hear from sites who are like, we won't use central campaigns. Like, is that something you guys run across or that you experienced still?
We do. Our when we get brought in by a sponsor, I'd say we shoot for a 70% opt-in rate from the sites. We typically get that 70-80%. But within that 20, there's a lot of people who are very opposed, and within even the 70 that might say yes, there's a handful that are doing so grudgingly. And we got a lot of work to do to make that up to them. So we have a team that actually goes and talks to the sites and tries to make it a lot less about the leads and about how can we help you? How can we help you figure this out?
Well, and that's and if I can segue on that a little bit, because I think that's interesting. Something we've seen, like, we usually will take central campaigns because, I mean, look, it's free advertising. We'd love to talk to more people rather than less. But the downside of that is then you've got somebody bugging you about following up with leads on. There seems to be a lot of different, ideas about, if you don't get to that lead within an hour, then they're gone. Or, you sort of hear these same old, sales ideas sort of trotted out. And you'd shared an article that I found really interesting about, timeframes when reaching out to patients. I mean, can you speak to that a little bit? I find it really fascinating from the site side.
Yeah, this is one of those things that you takes you a few years to really learn and think through. But there is a lot of belief, and a lot of it is, if the campaign's not going well, that there's a real easy target from a recruitment vendor's perspective, which is the site. Oh, the site's not following up. Site's not doing their job, and that absolutely happens out there. But we wanted to say, well, what does that mean? Because a lot of times, if you read something about that, it'll show you a proxy metric. It'll say, well, if you call within an hour, you're more likely to set an appointment. But an appointment isn't an enrollment, right? So the question is, how does that really actually have a ripple effect? And what is the ripple effect? If you wait a day, what's the loss? Like, let's quantify this. And we pulled all our studies together. We kind of normalized the conversion data, and it kind of blew my mind a little bit. But the sites that took 3, 4, 5 days to recontact a referral or contact them for the first time had no difference in whether that referral actually enrolled in the study. And it was really a week out before you even saw that drop, and we published that full data. And it just goes the boiler room approach. I get why people think it's important and necessary, but it really doesn't fit with what a patient is actually going through. You're telling a patient to potentially discontinue their medications, go visit a new doctor that they've never met before, sign up, read through a massive informed consent. This is not an easy decision. This is not, I need a new water bottle. This is if you're going to make a consumer analogy, it's like buying a house or buying a car. Most people are going to take their time. They want to think it through. They want to talk it through. They don't want to feel pressured. And the data really reflects that. And we, about 2 years ago, really changed our approach when talking to sites and said, make sure you have the time to have a good conversation with the patient. don't, if that means calling them tomorrow or calling them Thursday, that's fine. Do that. You don't drop everything you need to do. There was an interesting comment on that article. One person said, they have an analogous situation where, if you're calling around to get a quote for your house and there's a company that calls you back within minutes of you submitting an online form, it's like, what is that company's priority that they have someone ready to pounce on you like that? And I think that doubles in these kind of health environments. So, it was really surprising when it happened, but the more we've kind of processed it, it makes a lot of sense. You gotta engage with that patient. You gotta play a little bit of a long game with them.
Yeah, and I think we've seen that intuitively at our sites is that it's really more about the quality of the conversation, the quality of the engagement with that person, rather than blasting them within 5 minutes of filling out a form, which I often find they don't answer anyway. It does seem to be a little bit of a cat and mouse game, but I think that's important. And, I've been on studies where, we're getting hammered, and that's all they care about is like the speed by which, we get in touch with that patient. I'm like, hey, that's cool. We obviously don't want to let them sit forever because, presumably they filled that out because they are looking for some kind of help or some, answers or something. So you don't want to leave them necessarily hanging forever. But to your point, if you're calling them between patients, you're hurried, you're not giving them, the attention, then it's almost a worthless endeavor. And I actually appreciate that message. I think, it's not necessarily prioritizing that. And not unlike you, to your point, if you fill out something online and you get a call within minutes, I'm almost like more freaked out than I am excited to talk. I'm like, oh my God, what's happening?
Yep.
And I'll post that. I'll post that article. For some reason, StreamYard's not wanting me to do it, but I'll post on LinkedIn under this. And I think I don't know who this user is, but this is another good reason. I think, and I don't know how patient recruitment vendors feel about this, but I want to talk to every patient because if they don't qualify for that, at least I can get them in my database. I don't know. We've got 6 IBD trials. Maybe they don't qualify for this one, but they may qualify for another. Is there any I don't know, is that something that vendors care about necessarily?
It is. It's one, but it's one of those things. It's a little hard to talk about with our sponsor clients because the suggestion that they're paying us to run an ad that's going to end up enrolling some other study. There's a clean break. There's a handful of sponsors that totally get it and they understand that they're going to benefit in the other direction.
Yeah,
but there's a handful that really still to this day have some qualms, and so we got to kind of talk through that. And part of that is that attitude of I want to sign this patient up and I have a mechanism for keeping that patient warm at the site. That's kind of new, right? At least when I started, 15, 20 years ago, phase 3 trials were still mostly run by academic centers. A lot of, kind of physicians who were doing research on the side, who, were primarily private practice folks. We just ran a small site survey here, and 40%, our biggest segment in that response was dedicated private research sites. And that was not the case before. And I think sponsors are a little slow to understand that, first of all, that not all sites are the same. I just named 3 types of sites, and those are very, very different approaches. But my biggest source of kind of encouragement in the industry is this shift to sites that kind of, for lack of a better phrase, know what they're doing. They're invested in this. They're treating it like a thing that deserves their full attention, not as a side project. And my hope is that some of the stuff, like we just published this data, that sites are going to start collecting and publishing this data as well. That just says this is not a good ROI for us to be a boiler room operation. We've managed to convince a few of our clients. One of the things we occasionally have a site ask us is, well, what about all the people that didn't qualify? Can you give those anyways? And we've done it, and sometimes the sponsor will make us wait till the end of recruitment, but we can share that share that data. And it's a long game. You're going to see those sites again at a future campaign. You want to leave them with a positive, taste in their mouth about how that all went down. So I think it's great when a site actually wants to engage a patient for other studies.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I guess I've never thought to ask, like, can we get those non-qualified leads? And, oftentimes if I'm given the choice between a central campaign and running our own advertising, we may want to run our own. Frankly, we probably don't do as good of a job as, professionals who know what they're doing, but we're going to talk to more patients. So it's a wider net, I guess, so to speak, rather than getting the 5 pre-qualified. We're fine to talk to those 50, who got booted out, somewhere along the way. Do you see, you kind of spoke to it a little bit, but do you see a willingness to be involved with campaigns, like, or a distinction between, academic versus non-academic sites? I know that, I feel like in my past, like, academic sites oftentimes weren't as open to it, but maybe that's just my own experience.
Yeah, in general, not as open to it, or really concerned about right. You're happy to talk to 40 unqualified people because you may have uses for them. I think the big difference with academic sites is that they are not set up to do that, and they don't want that. So we actually have kind of gone back. It used to be all online. We kind of transitioned to entirely online pre-screening and passing it off to the patient. Now we found a lot of our sites and are demanding, fewer and more qualified referrals out of the campaign. So we'll put them through a secondary round where we'll talk to them on the phone first, before passing them on. And it goes back to one of the kind of things you say, what do sites want? And it's in one sense it's a terrible question because
Right.
it's very, very different from each other. It's like what do restaurants want? And I'm comparing the guy who's running the Italian beef down the road versus a Michelin starred restaurant versus someone who's running a hotel versus someone who's like a cook in a submarine. Like they don't have a lot in common, right? There's buckets, there's categories, but to suggest like sites want this or sites want that is one of the weird things that we say a lot in this industry, and just have to probably figure out how to not say that as much.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree, and feels funny coming from someone who cares a lot about sites, but also sites make a lot of terrible decisions that really aren't in their best interest. And it's interesting to hear you say too, like the more private sites or dedicated. So like, running a site is becoming more of a business versus you have to do it because you're attached to an academic institution and it's part of your title. But even, in academic institution I worked in, I found that like pharma sponsored research was not considered the cool thing to be doing, really. It was just sort of, they needed to pay some bills and, or have some relationships maybe. So I'm curious to see how this evolves. Like we're seeing more and more private consolidation, where ostensibly they're, trying to squeeze margins and run like a business. And I wonder what effect that'll have on more of the central recruiters.
Yeah. We have at least 2 sites here in the Chicago area that I've met where they started and they've existed for years as a side project for a particular physician. And the coordinators, in both cases, it was a coordinator who came and bought them out, and as they were retiring, and have just transformed the site into a research site. And there's no longer a medical practice attached to it. They've brought in new PIs, and they're better enrollers now. They're more engaged. It's a good trend, I think, amongst all of the gloom and doom. I think there's a real professionalization of the industry to a certain extent.
It makes sense. See, a shout out Dan, my favorite clinical research journalists out there. Is there any? Are you familiar with any data or research about unqualified leads that later go on? Is there any regular follow up? Sites definitely have, their databases generally within like a CTMS, and if we're collecting information on those phone calls. So again, if you're calling me about an IBD trial, but you have migraines, I'm going to record that in your chart. And when we have a new study come out, we're going to hit a campaign. We're going to text everybody who's got migraines or reach out to everyone who's got migraines. So it's definitely something sites do. I mean, I doubt there's much data or research around it, but anything you're aware of?
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I mean, there's also on the flip side, there's kind of a legacy of failure of big like central databases, right? Like, I mean, Quintiles had 40 million people allegedly, ready to go for a clinical trial, 15 years ago. And there've been a number of companies that have gone out there and said, well, we're building this great database. We've got all these people who are ready. Then when you actually say, okay, turn it on, let's see it, those people have moved on. They've done other things. They're making a decision at that point. So there's a balance between, you only have certain windows that are open in your life. If you're dealing especially with like a chronic medical problem, there's only going to be certain windows where you're really open to making a big change or a decision, and you can't just warehouse those folks, right? It's not, they won't keep. But if you're a site and you're local and you can talk to them and you've got stuff that's coming up soon or reasonably soon, I think it's a different game, right? I mean, I don't know of any research on the topic to answer Dan's specific question, but I do know, I mean, a little bit of thinking, I could come up with, half a dozen big central databases of patients that were were well hyped and that are no longer around, or soon to not be around. So
yeah, that's an interesting observation and like a nuance, I guess, in that like in building a database is cool, but to your point, people aren't forever shopping, quote unquote, like for a clinical trial. It is almost a moment in time. So it's like not just the right person, but like the right person at the right time, which I don't know anything about marketing or sales, but feels somehow like unique versus like, your example of like someone who wants to buy a water bottle or whatever the case is. I don't know. It strikes me that like there's some really interesting nuance in what we're doing, which is like salesy, or sales-ish, but also not. I don't know. I find it continually fascinating that how that works. You touched on a little bit about the privatization. Another article that I think you wrote, or at least were involved in, about the sort of myth of the one and done PI. I think another statistic we hear trotted out all the time of like, PIs who perform one research trial or one clinical trial and never enroll another. That appears maybe not to be the case based off of some faulty data. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, all right. To take a quick step back for a second, I mean, the thing you gotta just stop and admire for a moment is we work on these grand experiments, right? We say we have this new wonder drug, and the FDA says prove it, and they mean it. Like, you got to bring an enormous amount of data. Back in the days of paper, pharma companies literally semi-tractored full of documentation to submit to FDA. And these are rigorous tests, and they're really thoughtful about confounding behavior and missing data and how you account for loss to follow-up. And there's just so much information about how to really run a smart study and how to really think about the data that you're collecting. And then when it comes to the operations side, that just all kind of goes away. Suddenly it's like we're just passing along the same kind of received wisdom that we've heard a lot of times. And one thing we do is we've got these really incomplete data sources. The most famous one is clinicaltrials.gov, right? But clinicaltrials.gov is a great data set if you're only looking at pharma-sponsored trials in the United States, phase 2 or 3, after 2007. Everything else is optional. And when it's optional, you don't know what you're getting. You're getting all sorts of weirdness in there. Right. So people will talk about how much growth there is, and the same thing happened. FDA, 1572 forms. If the sponsor chooses to send it in, the FDA will publish it. And there's been these analyses run off that data set. And years ago, a guy, Howard Glass, kind of came out and said, "Is any of this, right?" because we just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. You don't know what's missing from the data. So he's just did a survey and found all of these one and done, and a large proportion of them turned out they were actually still active. It's just their 1572s didn't make it into the database. And it is amazing when we make this claim, this kind of pretty clear refutation of the claim comes out, but that's just never as interesting as the original story, and we just keep passing it along. And there's just so many examples of that, and this is this kind of storytelling that we do, and it's especially weird again because of just run these beautiful, well-structured, well-designed, complicated experiments at the same time, and we don't seem to learn from that.
Yeah, I mean, no, it's never lost on me. Yeah, that what we're doing is extremely rigorous, backed with data, but things like this no one seems to care. We just sort of make up these little stories, and a lot of it's marketing, I guess. I don't know. Extremely interesting. And I can say, I can't think of many examples of, I've worked with hundreds of doctors at this point, but very few who have done one and done. Again, anecdotal, but it's interesting. And I think a lot gets made out of that claim. And look, I don't disagree, especially, talking about trying to integrate trials if you're a busy physician, and then you get to realize how much of a pain in the ass it is, and how you're probably going to lose money if you're trying to hire your own staff to do it for, at least some period of time. So, hey, I'll use it as an, reason to get paid better. So let me keep that narrative a little bit.
Yeah. There's lots of reasons why we hold on to it. The other big issue is like the question we really want to answer is really hard, right? We don't really have the data to answer it, because if I'm thinking about turnover, if I'm thinking about the costs of losing people, it's not the one and dones I actually care about. Very few PIs do one study and they're like the best PI ever. Right. It takes training, right? So the ones we should be worried about are like the 8 and dones, right? Or the 5, someone who does it for a few years, builds up that knowledge base, and then just gets frustrated and quits. And so ask me how many 8 and done, investigators do we have? I have no idea, really, because that data is just doesn't exist. But that would be our problem, right? If we were losing people who had actually invested the time and effort, and then said, what, dealing with insurance claim denials is actually more exciting and fun than clinical research. I'm going back to private practice.
Yeah, no, it's a good point though. I mean, yeah, if you do a trial and you suck at it, and you quit, who cares? That shouldn't really be necessarily the biggest concern that we have. I'm going to hit up a couple of these questions, if that's okay. Some of this kind of circles back, but this begs a question, I think, itself. Is patient recruitment the top reason that trials fail? Which I think it's maybe something you had written about too. So it's another nice little segue. But I mean, is that truly the case?
Yeah. I spent a little time trying to go down that rabbit hole of 80% of trials are delayed due to enrollment and X% fail. And I traced it back to the 1990s was the actual originator, kind of patient zero of that stat. And it's in a book that I can't find anymore. It's the Parexel source book, and I've like literally written to a few different people trying to see, like, do you please have a copy of this in your basement somewhere? Because I would love to find the kind of original version of that myth.
Sure.
Again, if I look at all the clinicaltrials.gov, sure, there's a lot of individual investigators who get a grant to do something or get an idea, and they try to run a trial, right? They try to secure some funding, and you can go on to clinicaltrials.gov and find trials with one PI and a target enrollment of 100,000 patients. It's because you can kind of put anything you want if you're the PI. If I look at pharma trials, pivotal trials, phase 2, phase 3, that are actually going to support, be submitted to FDA or EMA for approval, no way. No, I mean, very, very few of those trials actually fail for enrollment. There's too much sunk cost to get them done. Some of them will be slow, But also a lot of them will just, happen in their time and get submitted. So again, I think a lot of that data is rooted in bad data sources. When when we talk to actual sponsors, especially big pharma, we don't hear that rhetoric. I don't recall ever being on a trial in 20 years, a pharma trial that was stopped because they just got tired of enrollment. Like I worked on one where I've worked on multiple where they've kind of rethought the development process as a whole, and they've killed off a trial because they thought it was going to be slow. But one of the things we don't talk about a ton is the math that sponsors do when they think about enrollment, which is the patent clock's burning when you're running that trial, but at the end you get a lot of that patent time back. Right? There's a whole extension math that happens, and that means there's not a lot of premium for speed on the sponsor side, nearly as much, because they're still going to have years of market time available for those drugs, and the biggest risk to them is something bad happening in the study, right? Bad data. There was a case not that long ago where thousands of patients had to be disenrolled from a trial.
Right.
There's no amount of speed that compensates for that level of risk. So
that's fascinating to me. So, and I've thought this a lot, but so where's the pressure for speed? Because we all feel it, at least at the site level, and I've always thought that this isn't really built for speed, right? And it shouldn't be. It should be about actually collecting quality data, not screwing things up terribly, which is oftentimes at odds with trying to go very fast. So why is there such an emphasis? Study sponsors are losing millions of dollars a day for every day that the study's not done. Another thing you see sort of tossed about, without a whole lot of data to back it up, apparently. Is there any who's in such a hurry?
Yeah, I mean the first thing to note is just like we were talking about sites, not all sponsors are the same, and we do work with an interesting mix of small biotech and large pharma, and there are some biotech companies that are on a burning platform, right? They've got a certain amount of dollars that they need data to make the next step. So those folks are a little more speed conscious, and justifiably so. I did write another piece on the $500,000 a day, in lost revenue, and that I don't even know what to say about. There's some things that are just so wrong that I don't even know how to kind of wrap my head around how we got there. It's just a number we keep throwing out. I mean, $500,000 is better. We used to say 3 million, and it's why would I assume that the clinical trial I'm working on, which this drug has a 5 to 10% chance of ever seeing $1 in revenue, is also going to be a blockbuster, right? I pose the question I play the lottery, but I have to wait till tomorrow to cash in my winning ticket. Did I lose $1 million because I waited a day? No, I mean, I still got the money. It still happened, but actually probably I'm not going to get the money at all, right? The risk is there. So I don't know, though, to go back to your actual question, where is that pressure coming from? And sometimes it just gets internally built up, I think, by study teams who are feeling some pressure to show results, especially if they've missed other milestones, right? I mean, I think on the sponsor side, the big pressure is site activation timelines. It just can't seem to get enough sites wired up. So if the few sites they do have aren't doing that much, then that becomes a highlight and an issue. And we solve the problems that are right in front of us and look easier to solve.
Right. Well, this is very off topic at this point, but something I've wondered about. AI cannot not read about it. I definitely see it helping like drug discovery. But then like, what's that going to mean for the immediate future? Maybe not immediate, but are we gonna, we're gonna have all these new drugs to test? But like, are we gonna have enough sites and patients to run them? Like, we're gonna find this weird bottleneck somewhere, right? Like, do you see that being an issue?
I mean, that would be amazing if it was an issue, right? Like the futility level is still so high. I
Fair.
mean, we've been through multiple waves of like, high throughput screening is the thing that's going to finally break through with drug discovery, and this intelligent modeling and protein folding technology, and
True.
it's still the same kind of rate over and over again, right? I think if you found a method, AI or otherwise, that actually had a higher rate of success with drugs, you just deprioritize all the traditional drugs we had and kind of focus on those, right? We always have way more compounds that might do something, right? So pharma's always kind of picking the best of what their options are to move forward. We're already in a resource constrained environment, right? If you went to any big pharma right now and said, we can give you 10 times your R&D budget, they would just, they've got the molecules, they've got stuff out there. What they don't have is any way of proving that any of it's going to work better, right? I mean, which fair? Like, how do you predict something that's going to go through 10 years of clinical trials in people with a specific disease and actually work? That's a much harder problem than we give it credit for.
I'm shocked that any of this works at all. Every day it feels held together by tape sometimes. So I'm amazed continually that we're able to do what we do, even if it's not as fast or successful as we want it to be.
Yeah, no, I think I was 6 or 7 years into working in recruitment before the first major program that we worked on recruited patients. That drug got approved. And that was amazing. I remember walking in. It was a small biotech, and they partnered with a large biotech, and saw the sign like now approved. And I was like, wow, this actually does happen sometimes. But it really literally took me 6 years before I got to experience that feeling.
That's crazy. Let's see. Let's take this long question. If it doesn't, I think it cuts it off. But I think this is interesting, and again, something I've considered several times. But what is really the better approach? Is it more, investing in education up front and building trust, or, driving recruitment numbers, then sort of using targeted education? I mean, I have to imagine the answer is a little from column A, a little from column B. But, I get curious about this too, because I mean, as sites, we don't get money or budget to invest in our community in terms of like building trust and getting out there, but we do get money to drive up recruitment numbers. So oftentimes we're sort of having to use that to get in front of more people. Do you think there's a lack of focus like on the upfront investment, so to speak?
It's a great question. I don't know that we have the data. It feels like a testable hypothesis, right? It feels like we should be trying different things and really measuring what we're doing, and then coming to conclusions. I will say, which I think you were kind of alluding to earlier, that the general efforts to raise awareness about clinical trials. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've read, what are the 4 phases of a clinical trial?
Right.
That we kind of go back to just this very basic stuff, and you have to ask, like, is this going to be relevant to someone and make them think this pertains to me and makes me want to go and learn about a trial, right? It's sometimes really hard to understand what you think the kind of behavioral line of that patient reading that stuff is going to be. So I would say, if we're going to do general education, and we don't work a lot in general education, we are very much like you, Continuum's work is this trial right now. This is the priority. Like, let's find the patients for this trial. We don't work as much in general education because it is hard to spot the ROI. But if we're going to do it, we should ask ourselves, what are the kinds of educational things that might actually result in people wanting to participate? and I think we get constrained in these boxes of very generic educational initiatives and awareness initiatives. And I can't see how those are gonna.
I mean, it is hard, and I mean, to go back to the point earlier made, like if the interest in a clinical trial is sort of a small window in time, like if, frankly, if I'm don't need a clinical trial and someone is trying to tell me about the phases of the trial, I'm going to be like, I don't care, sir. And it sounds bad, but I mean, it's not exactly exciting or sexy if you don't have a chronic disease that, you are seeking some sort of relief for, probably. But this is where I think sites, especially just being in their community, whether that be, maybe it's not educating patients per se, but just being around so that people know who you are. So when the time does come, you're at least trusted, like in your community where you're at. And that's not, I don't know how to get ROI from that, with just being a good member of your community so that people trust you. But I feel like there's something to be said about that.
Yeah, we have one site here in Chicago, Great Lakes Clinical Trials. I'll mention them by name. I was a participant in their COVID vax trial, so I like them. They did some great stuff, and they are very heavily active in the community. And it would be interesting to find out, kind of, do they really feel like that works for them, or is that just a kind of table stakes cost of doing business that they feel they've got to do to stay relevant? I think if you're therapeutically aligned, I think, obviously people go to, the Parkinson's Foundation, or they go to American Heart Association because they're looking for specific information about a specific condition.
Right.
That's a great opportunity to talk about why research is a good thing and might help. And if local sites have areas where they have good experience in one indication or one therapy area, those patients, especially with a chronic condition, there's going to be some value in people seeing that site as a resource in their community that they can go to.
Yeah, I don't disagree. All right, man, we're getting here 10 minutes to the top of the hour. Anything specific you want to hit here in this last 10 minutes, or we can always wrap up early, but anything on your mind or anything exciting lately?
Well, I did want to hear about how the new IRB is coming along.
I mean,
do you have any updates for us?
I'll tell you, man, I think all of my best ideas have started out as jokes. So we'll see. At first it was a joke, and then I was like, man, actually first of all, I was surprised by how many people, I mean, look, I've spoken at different things, and it's funny to hear people talk about. I don't think anybody loves that there's really just two IRBs kind of running the show, and that they're also like recruiting patients and doing other things that I think are like clear potential conflicts of interest in running what should be a objective, ethical board that shouldn't touch all these other things. So, I'm probably not the guy to do it. I'm more the guy to troll about it on LinkedIn, but I do think there's a need for that kind of thing. I'd like to see more, and not just because Advara or WCG will buy you out, in a couple of years, someone who's dedicated to doing it. I can barely run a site at this point, so I don't know if I'll be able to run an IRB too, but I think I'd like to see it. Like to see it happen.
Yeah. That is one area that I think there's been a fair bit of change. It's not daily change, but when I first started, when we were running a program, if you say like 2005, we would have maybe 40% of the sites using a central IRB, and the other 50-60% doing their own thing locally.
Mm-hmm.
And that also sucked, right? Like there were some definite issues there, and I remember having conversations with IRB chairs who had their own kind of personal views as to what ethical research should be, and they didn't feel bound by, just because HIPAA says you got to do this doesn't mean that I think you got to do this. Like I'm going over and above, and that was not a great system.
Right.
That was the original intent of the system, right? Is that investigators had a local ethical oversight.
Right.
But then you ended up with a weird patchwork. The weirdest one to me, and before WCG was WCG, it was WRB, and before it was WRB, it was Western IRB, and we had a study. And this is years ago, so I don't, no fault to anyone who's currently there, but we had two protocols, exactly identical except slightly different dosing. And somehow one protocol ended up with one reviewer at Western, and one protocol ended up with another. And all of our outreach, stuff got rejected by the one and approved by the other. And it was the exact same materials. And they did certain things, like one was fine with us calling it a clinical trial, but the other one insisted that we change it to clinical research study. Why that was a mandatory change, was not, and it took us a couple of weeks working with the chair to sort that out. I think it's fair to say WCG is a more streamlined operation than Western was then.
Sure.
Is that the right answer though too? Yeah, I mean,
yeah, it's tough. I mean, yeah, man, I worked with local IRB when I started out in academia, and it was miserable. Waiting 9 months for approval while they picked apart every word of an ICF. So, I certainly don't, I'm not advocating for, to go back to something. I say back, I mean, local IRBs are still a thing, and they're still doing that. And honestly, it's been surprising. I think we got awarded some studies recently, and I've seen 2 new IRBs I've never heard of, pop up. So to your point, I think in a previous comment, seems like there is some movement already on sort of the IRB front. So it'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, I would think so, right? You'd think that people with money would sense, revenue opportunities where two can't be the right number for something this scale, and we kind of over consolidated, over corrected, and it would be nice if the market kind of got us to a new point. But I believe that there are probably pretty bright people out there looking at that. I don't know why it all collapsed the way it did. I mean, there's really interesting bit of research and history for someone to do there. Is kind of how did we get here from there? How did we go from kind of everybody gets their own ethics board to there only being 2, and we did that in 15, 20 years. I don't have great answers to that. I think it's a really interesting question though, in terms of what the implications are for how we move forward.
Yeah, we'll see. And it occurred to me that there's all kinds of companies popping up, but IRBs are one that I just hadn't seen until, again, very recently. So yeah, I'm sure, like you said, there's people out there aren't dumb. They'll figure out ways to make money in this industry, and that seems like a pretty smart one.
Yeah, and I did have one client that was using Sterling. I don't know if you remember a Sterling IRB. Oh, yeah. They one of the best things that ever happened. Feds ran a sting operation, right? They made up a fake clinical trial with clear risks and clear problematic ethical structure, and they submitted it to IRBs, and one of those IRBs said, "Great, looks good. This is approved." And that was the end of that IRB. And I think and hope that that lesson still sits in the back of everyone's mind today. That I mean, it was shocking when it happened. You don't think of FDA as kind of, being sneaky and running a sting, but that's what they did. And kudos to them for doing it. It keeps people a little more on their toes, then I'm all for it.
Yeah, gotta keep them honest, man. All right, we're in the last 5 minutes. Anything you want to plug, or where can people find you online?
Online, we're trying to push out a lot of info on LinkedIn. That seems to be the only real place these days. I just started up on Blue Sky. We'll see. I think I got my 3rd follower, so the momentum's all there. It's 50% growth. But nothing has really kind of worked yet. But always happy to talk. We'll be at scope coming up, and we'll have Continuum folks outsourcing clinical trials as well. We like to just sit and talk. I think last year, that's what I said. This year is the same thing. I'm available to drink beer and talk about clinical trials, or if you're a morning person, I'll drink coffee and talk about clinical trials. It's what I'm happy to do. So we'll be in full force out at Scope. So would love to meet anyone there.
Very cool. All right. Thanks, guys, for your comments, and catch Paul at Scope. I'll be there. I won't bail on you this time. I'll get a drink with you. I think I was too hungover last time.
Too many parties. You got to keep
I did. It's a lot. So thanks, guys. Until next week. Thanks for tuning in. And we are out. Not yet out.
Nope.